Hello, this is the third lecture in our course in social inequality. And today we'll be talking about social structure and the political economy of inequality. So I'm going to go to the screen share and pull up our PowerPoint. This third lecture kind of builds on the first two that we've talked about, that we've done here in the sequence. It builds on where the first lecture left off in terms of trying to explain why it is that the social inequality began to worsen in the 1970s and 80s after decades of growing equality that followed World War II. That was kind of like where we left off with the first lecture. And in this lecture, we begin to look at the different economic and political factors that are sort of interrelated with one another in terms of how they explain this trend towards worsening social inequality after decades in which things actually had become more equal after World War II. And it also picks up from where we left off with the second lecture, and the insights that we gleaned from Marxist theory. And that is in terms of how to understand these changes that have happened in the last half century as a kind of class warfare, as a kind of class war by the wealthy, by the owners of capital that Marx called the bourgeoisie, or what Occupy Wall Street called the 1%. But the sort of wealthy elite who have looked to and successfully extracted greater surplus value from the working class, to use Marx's terms, the proletariat, or, as Occupy called them, the 99%. But the process of extracting more and more surplus value from the working class, or as is put in the textbook, The Age of Inequality, corporate America's war on working people. So to do that, we're going to talk about a number of key terms that are different, but you have to understand are definitely related, cannot be separated from one another. These are interrelated terms for understanding the economic and political term. And first and foremost, what we're going to be talking about is the term neoliberalism, which are ideologies and policies that favor free markets and low taxes for the rich and big business. And, it was also connected with these other trends that follow below that. So we have globalization, the enhanced spatial mobility of capital, the ability basically for capital to move around throughout the world in what people call a race to the bottom, where corporations, big businesses are looking for low-wage labor, the best tax subsidies or the lowest taxes, and for deregulation, for an absence of regulations about the environment or health and safety. So with the enhanced spatial mobility of capital, it basically means that corporations can kind of scan the globe looking for the most profitable and least taxy or regulated place to invest. Then thirdly, we have what's known as privatization, the transformation of public goods and services into private for-profit enterprises, especially around health and education and social welfare and social services. We have deregulation, which involves less government regulation over and oversight over business, particularly in finance, in the banking industry. We have deindustrialization, a process of closing factories as a result of automation or as a result of capital flight and globalization, but resulting in the decline of manufacturing and industrial cities. We have a process known as outsourcing, which involves the increasing use of contingent subcontracted labor, folks who are earning lower wages and have less job security and fewer workplace protections. We are going to talk about a process of austerity involving cuts to public services, education, healthcare, and so forth, particularly services that benefit the poor, have been the most cut and impacted by these trends. And then finally, union busting, basically anti-labor politics, efforts to disempower or altogether break labor unions. So again, these are all interrelated trends. They can't be understood separately. They all are kind of like a package deal, and we're going to talk about them under this rubric of neoliberalism. The film for this week gets into a lot of these topics, and we'll show you how they're kind of interrelated and how they've been like crammed down people's throats. The film is called The Shock Doctrine, and it's based on the best-selling book by Naomi Klein. The book has the same title. And basically the book and the film tell the story of how neoliberal free market policies originating in the United States have come to dominate over the rest of the world. And that process of domination has been through the exploitation of disaster-shocked peoples and countries. So what Klein does is describe a kind of economic shock therapy, which exploits crises like natural disasters or social upheavals, and uses those crises to establish controversial and unpopular policies in moments when citizens are too distracted or exhausted, either emotionally or physically or both, but too exhausted and distracted to develop an adequate response and resist effectively. So this is why Naomi Klein uses the metaphor of shock treatment and talks about the similarities with actual physical shock treatment and other forms of torture and interrogation propagated by the CIA and other government agencies to basically break down prisoners and to break down people into moments of like helplessness. And she says, kind of like in moments of disaster and crisis, we as people are paralyzed in a similar kind of way as what happens during shock treatment. And it's in these moments when we are paralyzed and helpless that these kinds of economic so-called reforms have been implemented, not because people wanted them or people chose them or people voted for them, but they've been institutionalized during these moments of shock and these moments of crisis. So the shock doctrine effectively debunks the myth that the global free market and neoliberalism triumphed democratically through popular choice. Instead, these policies have been forced on people who are paralyzed by shock during moments of crisis. As we'll see with the first film, Inequality for All, both in the shock doctrine and in Inequality for All, the 1970s are identified as a real turning point, a real pivotal moment in the use of this economic shock therapy of neoliberalism, privatization, and austerity. So again, we have this sort of puzzle, this question about why things started to change so dramatically in the 1970s, why this is such a pivotal decade for all the trends in social inequality that we're talking about. The sort of test case that Klein refers to in her book and in this film, the early test case for the shock doctrine of neoliberalism, came in Chile after a coup that the United States played a prominent role in orchestrating in September of 1973. Basically, the government, the coup involved the overthrow of a democratically elected socialist government in Chile that was led by a Marxist named Salvador Allende. And the United States, because Allende was a self-proclaimed Marxist and because he had run on a campaign to nationalize key industries like copper, Allende was seen as a real threat to American interests and to the interests of corporations, is threatening the economic interests of big business. And so there's been all of these declassified documents that have since revealed that the president at the time, Richard Nixon, his right-hand man, Henry Kissinger, and the US government at large, in the State Department, which had branded Allende as a dangerous communist, were well aware of this coup and took an active role in its plans to overthrow the Allende government. And then after they sort of overthrew that government, they installed a military dictatorship headed by a guy by the name of Pinochet. And under this authoritarian Pinochet regime that followed, Chile began to adopt economic policies from a guy that we'll talk about here in a minute, named Milton Friedman, and his disciples at the University of Chicago, these group of economists who are known as the Chicago Boys. And so it's here where we get the first instance where Chile is a kind of laboratory for imposing these policies of neoliberalism, privatization, austerity, and so forth after 1973. Chile becomes a kind of the first guinea pig for testing out what Klein calls economic shock therapy. So after this post-coup, Chile served as a laboratory for the economic shock treatment of neoliberalism. Klein goes to show then how this shock doctrine has since been applied in numerous parts of the world during various moments of crisis and disaster and upheaval. So she talks about in Britain how Margaret Thatcher, after she came to power in 1979, applied shock therapy during the early 1980s, facilitated by the Falklands War and a really sort of brutal police repression of the strike by the miners. In Poland, she shows how the left-leaning trade union known as Solidarity won the country's 1989 legislative elections, but were really hamstrung in their ability to do anything, and subsequently employed the shock doctrine as a result of pressure from the International Monetary Fund, the IMF. In Russia, she shows how after the collapse of communism, Boris Yeltsin came and took power with the collapse of the Soviet Union and crafted economic policy that turned Russia into effectively a capitalist oligarchy that Vladimir Putin has sort of ruled over since the year 2000. And then she shows how during the 1997 Asian financial crisis, the so-called four tiger nations of Hong Kong, Singapore, Taiwan, South Korea, all of those were forced to sell off numerous state enterprises to private foreign companies. Again, this process we call privatization. But really, the most kind of bald-faced, extreme example of the shock doctrine she shows has to do with the United States invasion and occupation of Iraq in 2003. And Klein describes this as the most comprehensive and full-scale implementation of the shock doctrine ever attempted, with mass privatization of Iraqi state-owned enterprises and the enrichment of private defense contractors based in the United States. For example, Halliburton Industries, that was basically run by the former Vice President Dick Cheney. So all of this, kind of adds up to the way in which, as she says, like the Iraq War was like the most privatized for-profit war in history, as far as like these private defense contractors being able to, just make a ton of money as a result of the United States government's invasion and occupation. So what Klein is describing here is what she calls the disaster capitalism complex, or a process of disaster capitalism as a complex series of networks and influence employed by private companies that allows them to profit from disasters. So what she's basically trying to show you is how disaster and crisis have been actually opportunities for multinational corporations and for financial institutions to come in and impose these kinds of policies that are very favorable to their economic interests, but detrimental to the interests of the vast majority of the population. And so that's why they do this during moments of crisis and disaster. They wouldn't necessarily been able to pull this off in normal times. It's during these moments of disaster and crisis where they can kind of cram these incredibly unpopular and undemocratic policies down the throats of the people who are kind of, in paralysis as a result of a crisis. So we kind of throw all these interrelated political and economic trends under this rubric of neoliberalism, which advocates for minimal government regulation or minimal government interference in the so-called free market, and which calls for small government, in which the state's role is limited to the protection of private property and law enforcement. Thus, they advocate for the minimization of social welfare, public education, and government programs. So this is kind of the language that is employed around neoliberalism, the language of free markets, the language of small government. They dare not, say the quiet part out loud about enriching the wealthy and big business and multinational corporations. It's kind of, disguised in this smokescreen of free markets and small government, and that is why we refer to it as a kind of ideology. The liberalism in the name of neoliberalism sometimes throws people off it's important to remember that the liberalism in the name refers to classical liberal economic thought of people like Adam Smith, going back to the 18th century. And so it's really, neoliberalism is really more akin to like libertarianism and libertarian ideology, rather than what we usually in the modern day call liberalism. So it's important to kind of keep that in mind, that this is really at its root a kind of libertarian ideology about low taxes, small government, free markets, lack of government regulation, and so forth. And so neoliberalism can really be described as a kind of ideology, as a form of ideology in the sense that the ruling ideas are in every epoch the ideas of the ruling class. This is a quote from Marx and Engels that I talked about in lecture number 2, coming from the German ideology, in which they talk about the connection between the ruling ideas and the ruling class, basically the way that the dominant ruling class is able to use its wealth and power to also dominate the field of ideas, and to make sure that the ideas that are circulating in society are ones that favor their interests. That is what we call ideology. And so while claiming to benefit universal interests, claiming to benefit everybody as a kind of trickle-down economics, the fact of the matter is that neoliberalism has functioned to empower and enrich the wealthy at the expense of the working class. And not to mention at the expense of the natural world, of the natural ecology of our environment. So this is another way in which ideology works. It pretends or has a facade, a smokescreen of claiming to be in the universal interests of everybody. In this case, neoliberalism has sort of claimed that, well, if the rich get rich, the rest of the wealth will trickle down to the rest of the population. This is what's called trickle-down economics. And so for years, this was an idea, and still is an idea that's espoused, that, why we have to cut taxes for the wealthy and big business, because they're the job creators. And if they are doing well, then like the wealth will trickle down to the rest of us. But as time goes on, we have more and more statistical evidence to show that this just is not true. That basically the wealth has not trickled down, the wealth has stayed at the top. And as the rich have gotten richer, the rest of the population has been struggling to get by. And so as a kind of ideology, neoliberalism has functioned to empower and enrich the wealthy at the expense of everybody else, and also, I would add, at the expense of nature. As a kind of economic theory, neoliberalism began to emerge with this guy who's pictured here, with President George W. Bush, this guy by the name of Milton Friedman. He's featured very prominently in the shock doctrine. It also emerged, with an Austrian economist by the name of Hayek, and a number of other economic thinkers and economists in the period around World War II and shortly thereafter. So we can say that neoliberalism emerged, roughly around the 1950s as a reaction against what is called Keynesianism, the idea that government should play a significant role in managing free market capitalism through high taxation in order to provide public services such as unemployment benefits, healthcare, and education. The Keynesian economics was a crucial part of the national strategy for responding to the Great Depression of the 1930s, and then responding to World War II. So it comes from this economist by the name of John Maynard Keynes. And the idea was that instead of government sort of, taking a step back, that government needs to actually take an active role in managing the economy, and also in redistributing wealth so that it puts money in the hands of consumers and working people. And so you have to have, under Keynesian economics, you have to have a whole set of social programs like unemployment insurance and Social Security and Medicare and Medicaid, and public education. All of these are forms of, social policy and social institutions that are meant to stimulate the capitalist economy from the ground up, by putting money into the hands of working people or unemployed people, as the case may be, building public institutions, and sort of the idea of that like a rising tide lifts all boats. That like if you build an economy from the bottom up, that this will serve as a kind of a stimulus, or as Keynes put it, priming the pump. Neoliberals such as Thomas Friedman came along, again, like in the 1950s, starting at least in the 1950s, claiming that this Keynesian model of the organizing the economy was inefficient, and in their words, it inhibited freedom and choice. Again, as like ideology, they use those terms, freedom and choice, a lot, as a way that is, appealing to a universal interest, but really is at the same time masking a real class interest, right? And so their ideas, the idea of neoliberalism was always like kind of subordinate to Keynesian economics. Keynesian economics was, really the dominant way of seeing things in the 1940s and 50s and 60s. But then, in the 1970s, this idea of neoliberalism started to gain traction, particularly with the powerful, with multinational corporations, with financial institutions, with the super wealthy, and with, in the United States, the Republican Party, and in England, the Conservative Party. All of these powerful actors started to look to neoliberalism as a preferred alternative to Keynesianism in the 1970s. So it's no coincidence that Milton Friedman's ideas, even though they had been germinating for decades, really started to become the new orthodoxy in the 1970s, as Friedman would be awarded the Nobel Prize in 1976, for example. As discussed in the film The Shock Doctrine, Milton Friedman, as a professor of economics at the University of Chicago, trained a whole group of economists who came to be known as the Chicago Boys. And they would be key advisors to the Pinochet regime in Chile after the 1973 coup. So basically, like what the coup in Chile does is that it presents an opportunity for these Friedman and these Chicago Boys to go in and implement their ideas, this kind of neoliberal agenda, these neoliberal policies and legislation. And so this is like, the sort of first test case, as Naomi Klein writes about. Friedman was thus an influential figure in implementing economic shock treatment, around the world during moments of crisis. After this, into the 1970s and 80s, after he retired from the University of Chicago in 1977, Friedman served as an advisor to the American President Ronald Reagan in the 1980s, and also the British Prime Minister Margaret Thatcher, two very conservative politicians who, as we will see, played a major role in implementing a lot of these ideas in the United States and the United Kingdom. Now, Klein in the shock doctrine talks about how Milton Friedman became very aware about how like a crisis could be used as an opportunity to implement these kinds of policies that would otherwise be very unpopular during normal times. And she quotes him as saying, "Only a crisis, actual or perceived, produces real change." This comes from his book called Capitalism and Freedom. So Milton Friedman was himself aware that these moments of crisis, again, whether it's an actual crisis or just the perception of a crisis, it opens a window of opportunity in which you can jam these kinds of policies down the throats of the population who otherwise wouldn't stand for it. In his essay for The Age of Inequality, Senator Bernie Sanders talks about Milton Friedman as the failed prophet. He says Friedman was, this is a quote, "Friedman was more than an academic. He was an advocate for and popularizer of a radical right-wing economic ideology." I'm sorry, I can't do a better impersonation of Bernie Sanders and his very distinctive trademark voice and method of delivery. I'm sure you're all pretty familiar with that, so I'm not going to, embarrass myself with a bad impersonation. But you can certainly picture and almost hear Bernie saying these words. And he was writing them in 2009. And that's significant because, in writing in 2009, Sanders was lambasting the hypocrisy of Friedman and his acolytes at a moment when deregulation had provoked this financial crisis. And in the wake of that financial crisis that, starts in 2007, 2008, the banks had started to, default and started coming to the government asking for a bailout, basically for a handout. And so Bernie Sanders in this article is basically like pointing out the hypocrisy of doing this when for decades, these same neoliberal ideologists had been, mandating austerity and cuts to welfare for working people and for the poor, talking about, how, poor people and working people were going to have to tighten their belts and they weren't going to be able to take the handouts from the government anymore in the form of welfare. And then when the banks start collapsing, they turn around and basically ask for their welfare check. They ask for their bailout, despite what they had preached, for years and years about how capitalism was this, survival of the fittest, and, capitalism rewards the best companies and punishes the worst companies by, having them go bankrupt. And this whole kind of Darwinist sort of metaphor was totally exposed. And the lie was put to it by the financial crisis, the 2007, 2008, and the way that the banks got bailed out. As people, chanted during Occupy Wall Street, the banks got bailed out and we got sold out. The financial crisis really exposed the failures and hypocrisies of neoliberalism. And this is why Senator Sanders refers to Friedman as a failed prophet. He describes his influence, furthermore, as a reactionary political program supported by the wealthiest, greediest, and most powerful people and institutions in this country. Pretty definitive statement there. So neoliberalism, just to back up historically a little bit, had during the 80s was pretty fully implemented in the policies of Ronald Reagan and Margaret Thatcher, both of whom came from the right side, the conservative side of their respective countries' political system, the Republican Party in the US and the Conservative Party in England. But then in the 1990s, these policies also started to become adopted and accepted by the Democratic Party in the US, particularly under Bill Clinton, and the Labour Party in the United Kingdom under Tony Blair. And so what basically happened was that neoliberalism became not just like a right-wing agenda, but now became increasingly like the consensus, that it became a sort of bipartisan agreement. So with both parties largely accepting these assumptions of neoliberalism, there was a broad bipartisan consensus that there is no alternative. This was actually a thing that Margaret Thatcher had said, that there is no alternative. And neoliberalism, in the 1990s started to be known as the Washington Consensus, again, because it was not just being pushed by the Republicans now, but also by the Democrats under Bill Clinton, who, pushed through things like the North American Free Trade Agreement, NAFTA. So wherever it was implemented, neoliberalism enacted several common features. There was, lowering taxes on wealth, corporations, and high income earners. There was the deregulation in terms of reducing the number of rules and regulations on big businesses, especially on the banks and finance. There was austerity and budget cuts for social programs and public services, again, especially those servicing the poor, but also, for public universities and public schools, services that also, are directed towards working people and the so-called middle class. The privatization of formerly public services, international free trade agreements such as NAFTA, and then union busting and anti-union legislation. These are all, again, like interrelated policies and pieces of legislation and, political efforts that have to be understood as interconnected with one another. Even if they're not the same, they are not separable. So when we look at, for example, tax cuts for the wealthy, which was sort of like the number one priority of these conservative administrations when they got into power, first thing that they, one of the first things they do is start cutting taxes for wealthy people and big businesses. We see from this chart that the tax rate for the wealthiest Americans was at its highest period was at its highest in the period roughly between 1945 and the early 1960s. We see it was like pretty low up until about 1930, and then starts to increase pretty dramatically and reaches its peak in 1945 when the highest earners are being taxed at a rate of 94%. Now they would have, don't feel too bad for them because they had plenty of deductions and write-offs and other ways in which they weren't paying 94%. The wealthy did just fine around World War II, but they were being taxed at a much, much higher rate than they ever have been since. And again, this was part of like the Keynesian economic strategy, is that in order to pay for public schools and highways and social services and public health, you have to tax the people that have the most resources. You have to tax the wealthy. And so that was, sort of like the common sense of economics and politics going, all the way up through into the early 1960s and 70s. And we see that the real turning point here is when Ronald Reagan is elected president in 1980, and then takes over the White House in 1981, and dramatically cuts the taxes on for the highest earning individuals. You see in the chart how there's a precipitous drop off in the tax rates starting in the 1980s. And again, this is justified in terms of trickle-down economics, the idea that we have to relieve the wealthy from their tax burden so that they can create jobs, and then the wealth will trickle down to working people and to the rest of us. And like I said, we have now decades of statistical evidence to show that that just didn't happen. But still, they've still kept cutting taxes, particularly whenever the Republican Party has got into power. They've made it a priority to cut taxes. Most recently with the Trump administration in 2017 was one of the few policy pieces that the Trump administration was able to accomplish, was to cut taxes for the rich even lower. And so now, you can see that the tax rates for the wealthy are back to where they were like in the before like the Great Depression, like in 1930. The flip side of these tax cuts for the wealthy has been budget cuts and austerity for public services like education, housing, healthcare, social welfare. So as there have been cuts in the tax revenue coming from the wealthy, that has been used then to impose austerity and budget cuts for services that are used by working people and the middle class and the poor. As Richard DeVolf reports in his article for The Age of Inequality, written back in 1982, he says their chief goals were to get back at the poor and underprivileged, welfare mothers, university intellectuals, environmentalists, and occupational health safety advocates, social workers, and legal aid practitioners, all these people that that the elite didn't like, that the wealthy wanted to sort of enact some kind of sadistic revenge upon. So cutting taxes was part and parcel with these budget cuts and austerity. They've worked together as like two sides of the same coin. So that, after you've cut taxes for the wealthy, you could say, well, we don't have money for, college education, or we don't have money for public schools, or, for housing or healthcare. And so therefore we need to cut the budget and impose, this kind of austerity where we're going to basically force working people to tighten their belts and live at a lower standard of living. So, in Marxist terms, this is part of, extracting greater surplus value out of the working class as a whole. Now, deindustrialization has been, again, a part of these economic and political trends that really take off in the 1970s and 80s that, have very much gutted the working class people and working class communities across the United States, and also in Britain and other advanced industrial economies, but we're just going to be talking about the United States example here. Deindustrialization refers to basically the closing of factories and loss of manufacturing jobs, and it's been especially devastating in the Northeast and the Midwest regions of the United States, what is sometimes called the Rust Belt, because these are cities that were built on heavy industry, on automobile manufacturing, on steel factories, in all kinds of like heavy industry and manufacturing. And now you can like drive through these cities and they in many cases kind of look like ghost towns, like they've been gutted. And that is because of this trend known as deindustrialization that really starts to accelerate in the 1970s and 80s. And it's at this time that somewhere between 32 and 38 million manufacturing jobs are lost, are destroyed for any number of reasons. So we can sort of compare and contrast, like in 1970, before this had largely begun, manufacturing made up something like 25%, 1 out of every 4 jobs in America was something to do with making stuff, with manufacturing. By 2013, it was less than a tenth. It was 8.8%. So quite a dramatic change. And this has also been a dramatic change because the manufacturing jobs, the previous manufacturing jobs that have been lost, tended to be higher paying and more secure insofar as they were unionized. So if workers belong to the United Auto Workers, or they belong to the United Steelworkers, a union, then they tended to have higher pay, lower working hour, or shorter working hours, safer working conditions, more vacation time. They could live at a higher standard of living. What has basically, as those manufacturing jobs have been lost, they've tended to be replaced by job growth in the service sector, in all matter of social services, where wages tend to be lower, and there's much less of a union presence. So again, this is part of why we see this growing inequality since the 1970s and 80s, is because of deindustrialization, the loss of manufacturing jobs, and the replacement of manufacturing job with these like service sector jobs, what we might call like MIC jobs, that don't pay as well, that are more likely to not be full-time, that are more likely to be, like temporary or contingent, that, have fewer benefits, and that have fewer, like less job security. All of these things contribute to making a very precarious situation for more and more working people. This is why the book, refers to the precariat, like the precarious proletariat in America. Several factors have contributed to this process of deindustrialization. It's not just been one thing, it's been like a perfect storm of all kinds of factors coming together to produce the same outcome. So a big one has been, the moving of factories to developing countries with cheaper labor, what I referred to earlier as like globalization or outsourcing, or like the race to the bottom, the way in which like capital flight, capital mobility has been enabled to look around the world for the best deal in terms of low wage labor and low rates of taxation and fewer regulations and that sort of thing. We see, along with this, the outsourcing of work to subcontracted companies. Sometimes that happens within the United States. Sometimes that happens to overseas. So the sort of like an international export of jobs. The replacement of human labor with machinery, what's called automation. That has also been a real destroyer of manufacturing jobs, human beings basically being replaced with machinery, with computers, in some cases with like robots in the factory. This is as Marx pointed out, this is an age-old process of capitalism, replacing human labor with machinery. And finally, union busting, which we're going to talk about here in a minute, a sort of a more political frontal attack on the power of unions and on the power of organized labor as a social force. A couple of articles, sort of in the Age of Inequality, put like a human face on some of these processes and how deindustrialization impacted all of these different Rust Belt communities, all the way to this day. A lot of them, these, especially like these smaller and medium-sized Rust Belt cities, never really like recovered from deindustrialization. They still are, kind of to this day, pretty gutted. So in his article, Daniel Marshall talks about the 1977 closure of the steelmaking facilities around Youngstown, Ohio, in which like 5,000 workers lost their jobs because the Likes Corporation, the main employer in town, had steadily been draining its profits and investment out of the Youngstown plants and into other parts of their business. So basically they were making a profit, but not reinvesting those profits in the factory and in the plant in Youngstown, and then finally started to make all these moves to basically close. And Marshall writes about the devastating effects that this had on the local community. He says, for factory workers here, producing steel is not just a 9-to-5 job, but a source of pride and a way of life that begins at the mill and extends into the neighborhood bar, the corner church, and the local union hall. So it's like people not only like lost their paychecks, but they lost like their source of identity, and they lost their connections to their community. They lost, as Marshall says, like a whole way of life and their source of pride. So this has, a devastating impact on this community and on the lives of these workers. Similarly, in his article, W.P. Norton talks about the 1988 closing of the Chrysler auto factories in Kenosha, Wisconsin. Another one of these kind of like mid-sized industrial cities in what we call the Rust Belt, where 5,500 workers, almost the entire workforce, were laid off And Chrysler, basically, the car company, had recently purchased the auto manufacturing plant, which was the oldest auto manufacturing plant in the United States, going way back to 1903. And so Chrysler basically purchased this factory, and had promised originally that they were going to keep it at full strength, that they were going to keep everybody employed. But then shortly after the purchase went through, in 1988, they turned around and announced that they would be closing most of the facilities. And Norton again describes the devastating aftermath of this decision in the local community. He says rates are predicted to surge in the areas of crime, suicide, spouse and child abuse, drug and alcohol addiction, and murder. Also predicted to rise are stress-related diseases such as ulcers, high blood pressure, heart attacks, insomnia, and mental disorders. Again, if you go to some of these communities to this very day, you continue to see the devastating impact that this has had on communities, and the way that that this has had impacts on people's health, on all of these social problems and social issues that do worsen when mass numbers of people are suddenly laid off and they lose, not just their paycheck, but their source of identity and their sense of community. The devastating public health effects that this has had since the 80s and 90s. A lot of these communities have become, havens for methamphetamines and for opiate, like opiate addiction. The real opiate crisis, not coincidentally, has really taken hold in a lot of these communities where there's just a declining sense of opportunity and a declining sense of hope in people's lives. A third example that I wanted to talk about, and it's a film that I highly recommend. I didn't assign for this class, but you might check it out on your own. It's pretty entertaining. Michael Moore's debut film called Roger and Me, which portrays the regional economic impact of General Motors' closure of several auto plants in Michael Moore's hometown of Flint, Michigan. Flint, Michigan had, been a real center of the automobile industry. And starting in the late 1970s and into the 1980s, they began to engage in mass layoffs of auto workers. Basically, General Motors was starting to move more and more of its factories to Mexico, where it could pay workers a fraction of what they were earning in Michigan. And they didn't have to General Motors didn't have to deal with the union, the United Auto Workers they didn't have that sort of thing in Mexico that they would have had to contend with. So the layoffs effectively reduced General Motors employees in that area from 80,000 in 1978 to about 50,000 in 1992. And today there's just a few thousand auto workers in Flint, in the place that was really kind of the birthplace of the United Auto Workers and the automobile industry in the United States. And so it's a pretty sad film that shows how this community that was once thriving and pretty affluent, in which auto workers could live at a high standard of living in the 1950s and 60s when Michael Moore was growing up, how this community went into a spiral of decline, a real free fall in the 1980s, and continues to be a place of high murder rates and crime, a place of high poverty. You may remember for a while that Flint, Michigan didn't even have like clean drinking water, that there was this whole like water crisis that had been engineered by the Republican governor of Michigan. That, you know, the standard of living went from being among the highest in the United States in the 1950s and 60s to now among the lowest. And it's directly correlated with this process of deindustrialization. So Michael Moore chronicles in this film how General Motors had previously defined his childhood growing up in Flint, and how the company was at one point this primary economic and social hub of the town. He points out that Flint is the place where there was the great sit-down strike of 1936 and 1937, which resulted in the birth of the United Auto Workers. That's how the UAW, the union representing auto workers, got started, was with this occupation of the factory in Flint, a sit-down strike in which the workers basically took over the factory. And it, you know, it was a sort of a long, protracted strike that finally ended up with the creation of the UAW, which, you know, eventually became like the largest labor union in the United States. So deindustrialization and union busting have kind of gone hand in hand as the story of Michael Moore's Roger and Me and some of these, many of these other industrial cities, you know, sort of tell us this story. In his article for the Age of Inequality called Equal Time for Union Busting Firms, written back in 1980, the reporter Richard Kazis reports that about $100 million a year was being spent at that point on union busting firms. Now, union busting has a much longer history. It's often been very violent, you know, in which like employers have hired you know, goon squads and, you know, groups of thugs to beat up people on strike, and so there's often been like a physical component to it, like a violent component to it, but there's also been like this legal and political component to it, in which basically like there have been these union busting firms that have lobbied for, you know, anti-union legislation or a whole myriad of ways in which they can sort of disempower workers and keep workers with just a minimal amount of like rights. So as the reporter wrote in his article, these union busting firms, they see unions as obstacles to productivity and profit, and perhaps more important, as threats to employers' total control over his workforce. Their model is not democracy, but enlightened despotism, with their firms serving as well-rewarded advisors to the kings. So they, you know, in the 1970s and early 1980s, there's just this kind of counter move by capital to try to limit the power of organized labor. To use like Marx's terms, there's an attempt to extract more surplus value out of the working class by limiting their rights to organize as part of a union. So the real pivotal moment in this process, it comes in 1981 when Ronald Reagan first takes office in the United States, And he basically fires about 11,000 air traffic controllers who had gone on strike, and they were, federal employees, and so he was sort of like legally and politically within their rights to do so, and not only to fire those air traffic controllers, but also ban them from any future federal service. But the impact was even much greater than just like firing these 11,000 people. The impact of the mass firing was to send a chilling effect across the whole labor movement. It basically signaled that the Reagan administration had these deep anti-union sentiments, and that there was like a new sheriff in town, is the way that like Reagan would put it, that they weren't going, that they were hostile to labor unions. And so this really begins a process of like actively anti-union politics, in which like the labor movement finds itself like increasingly on the defensive about having to defend itself against this kind of counterattack that's coming from the political right wing. David Moberg writes about this in his article, "As Patco Goes, So Goes the Unions." This is again back in the 1981, around the time that this was happening. And Moberg reports that about 80%, like 4/5 of those air traffic controllers, came into their jobs through the military. And many of them had served in the Vietnam War. So this is a real kind of cruel irony in which, Ronald Reagan had gotten elected in part on this message that like, the troops in Vietnam had been disrespected, by the left and the anti-war protesters and the hippies, and that they'd been spitting on the soldiers, coming home from Vietnam and all this kind of thing. Reagan, wanted to make himself into sort of like the hero representative of the military and this Vietnam War. And first thing he does is he turns around and fires thousands and thousands of people who had come home from Vietnam and gotten these jobs as air traffic controllers because they had experience in the Air Force or the Navy, and these sorts of things, and their skills translated over into being air traffic controllers. And so it was a kind of a cruel irony of the Reagan administration. Going a little bit further into the 90s and into the 2000s, as Walmart became the largest employer in the United States, sometime in the 90s, I think, Walmart replaced General Motors as the largest private employer in the United States, and that's a real barometer of the economic changes that were happening. That General Motors was like laying people off in huge numbers as part of this larger process of deindustrialization. And the new jobs that were being created were more like these Walmart jobs, these service sector jobs. And so Walmart, basically became the largest private employer in the United States sometime in the 90s or 2000s. And Walmart took a very aggressive anti-union approach in preventing its workers from organizing for union representation. And so Chris Hayes writes about this in his article called "Symbol of a System," in which he says that more than 300 charges were filed against Walmart, quote, accusing the company of, among other transgressions, firing employees for suspected union activity in violation of the Wagner Act. The Wagner Act is basically a piece of legislation from the 1930s that guarantees that workers have the right to organize a union in their workplace. and among other things, it makes it illegal to fire people if they're, just because they're engaged in union organizing. Now, that doesn't really stop companies from firing people when they're engaged in union organizing, as Walmart did, and today we see Starbucks and Amazon continuing to do that, but it is illegal, and so you should know if you're if you're a worker and say if you work at Starbucks and you're organizing a union, they can't legally fire you for organizing a union. That doesn't mean that they won't illegally fire you, but they can't legally do it. So in the words of one union organizer, Walmart's not a bad apple. It's the very symbol of a rotten system. And so again, we see these similar kinds of things today with regard to Starbucks and Amazon, where labor unions have started to form, and where they have retaliated by illegally firing people for organizing. And then finally, we see how this union busting has kind of migrated onto a war against public unions, about like state employees, people who work in the public sector. So in his 2011 article called Capital Offensive, David Moberg writes about the efforts of Wisconsin Governor Scott Walker and other Republican governors in a dozen states to disempower and destroy unions that were representing public sector employees. So people who work for the government, or people who work for the school system, or people who are engaged not working for private enterprises, but for the public sector in one form or another. As the president of the American Federation of Teachers, the AFT, put it, this is a power grab to foreclose public service workers out of a middle-class lifestyle by first taking away their voice and then doing as much as they can to minimize their political activity. But this was not something that public sector employees took lying down. When this legislation was proposed in Wisconsin, it was met with this huge reaction by thousands of workers, shown in this picture here, who occupied the state capitol in Madison, Wisconsin, to protest, the cuts that were being imposed on their pension plans, and also the governor was trying to basically limit their ability to have political influence, to have a voice in politics. It was a pretty bald-faced, blatant move by the governor in Wisconsin and by governors in a bunch of other states that tried to do the same thing, to basically try to limit the power of the public sector unions, and to cut their pensions and all sorts of both economic and political measures to kind of break these public sector unions. So all of this has had an impact, and the reason that we talk about this is because there's for purposes of this class, there's a direct relationship between union membership and social inequality. These are inversely related, in the sense that during times when union membership has been higher, there's been less social inequality. And in times when union membership has been lower, there has been more social inequality. This graph kind of shows you the way in which these things are inversely related. So in the period up until the 1930s, we see that there was low amounts of union membership and high amounts of social inequality. It was their workers didn't have the legal right to form a union until the Wagner Act was passed in the 1930s. And so it was very hard to get union representation up until that point. And as a result, workers' wages were low, and there was tremendous social inequality. The wealthy were able to profit from those low wages and lack of union representation. With the 1930s and going into the period between roughly the 1940s and the 1970s, the relationship totally changes. We see the red line here showing the increase in union membership. It comes to reach its peak sometime in the late 1970s. And as union membership increased, the amount of social inequality declined, the blue line in this graph. So again, they're directly related in an inverse fashion. One goes up, the other goes down. So as more workers were able to join unions and bargain for higher wages and bargain for more benefits and a higher standard of living, the amount of social inequality in society declined. And then finally, we see in the period around 1980, we begin to see a decline in union membership. Again, that's the red line. And as union membership begins to decline after 1980, we begin to see a steady increase again in the amount of social inequality, the blue line. So, again, as people have been less likely to, be part of the union, it means that their wages have declined, and conversely, the amount of wealth taken home by the 1% has increased. So again, the purpose of this graph is to show how these things are inversely related in a direct way. So taking just a more close look at the trends in union membership, again, we see how in the 1930s, there's a steady increase in membership in labor unions between the 1930s and 50s, when legislation like the National Labor Relations Act, which is the same thing as the Wagner Act, made it easier for workers to form and join unions. And then for all the reasons that we have tried to illuminate in this lecture, union membership began to fall dramatically in the 60s and 70s and has continued to decline to somewhere around 10% or less than that. And today we're seeing like a bit of a revival that I'll talk about in future video lectures, where the employees at Starbucks and Amazon warehouses and have begun to unionize, and we've seen more like strikes by teachers unions and things like that. So their labor is starting to have a bit of a resurgence, but it's nowhere near what it was like during this period in the middle of the 20th century, when unions were really at their strongest, and as a result, working people and middle-class people were able to enjoy a much higher standard of living than they do now. And the purpose of those last graphs is to show you that the people who've really been hit hardest by these trends in inequality and the decimation of unions have been those with less education. So as the trend shows, only college graduates have experienced any kind of growth in median weekly earnings since 1979, whereas those with less than high school education have seen their earnings precipitously decline. And again, I want you to think about this as something that's related to these questions, that like in previous generations, you could you didn't necessarily have to have a college education in order to live a pretty good standard of living. You could, if especially if you were part of something like the United Auto Workers, you could be somebody who just finished high school and yet still earned a higher wage, could buy a house, could send your kids to college, maybe, could take your family on vacation, you could have, a kind of like upward mobility. It's a sort of American dream that increasingly is just now not possible. Now those without a college degree, or certainly those with less than a high school diploma, have really seen a shrinking of their opportunities in the marketplace. And it's not coincidental, I think, that we see a lot of hopelessness and a lot of despair and all the kind of symptoms that come with that when people don't have opportunities to move up and like provide for their families, or for their children and so forth. So that basically takes us into from these questions of political economy and inequality into thinking about the class system. And in the next lecture, we'll be thinking about how this class system also intersects with inequalities of race and gender. So until then, I'm going to stop the lecture and say good day and see you next time. Bye.